faculty conversation series. Kiran Keshavamurthy teaches English in the department, and we are really looking forward to this talk that he is going to offer on the work that he's doing at the moment. So yes, Kiran.
Okay,
the floor is yours.
Much. Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much, Devika, and thanks to the department for organizing this talk. And thank you all for being here. Those of you who are on the Teams link and those of you who are watching from YouTube, thank you very much for being here, especially at a time when I'm sure many of you would rather be at the Speak Make Festival. So this is just a paper that I wrote for a edited volume, but it's also part of something that I've been working on. And this is, this is actually a comparative study of two autobiographies by two trans women, also known as Tirunangais, which of course in Tamil, of course, literally means, is a combination of two words, which is Tiru meaning Mr., in some cases also auspicious, and Nangai meaning women or woman. So it kind of brings the transgender element of the person in the name. And of course, there's also been a very contentious history of how to identify these people, what to call them, and now in some instances, of course, even Tirunangai is not a term that is universally accepted by everyone. Now, you also have a more technical term, which means an alternative, not the third gender, but an alternative gender. So you have different terms, but I'm just going to use the term Tirunangai, and in some cases also Hijra, and in some cases transgender, depending on, of course, firstly the preference of the authors themselves, and also in terms of when I'm making a conceptual argument. So let me just first begin with these two quotations, which I thought were very accurate and powerful in actually capturing the dilemmas faced by these two writers. And these are both autobiographical writings. So this is one, and I'll just read this out. This is a quotation from the first text, which is by A. Revathi, which is in English is called The Truth About Me, a Hijra life story, where she says, and this is the description of a train journey. This time I wore a sari and traveled in. I somehow made it to Salem and got into a local bus to go to the bus station, and then stopped to think. I couldn't possibly return home in a sari. I should change into men's clothes, I decided. I tried to find a room in some lodge near the bus stand, but no one appeared to want to let me in. I returned to the bus stand and decided to go to the women's toilet there. But the man who stood there to receive money for the pay and use toilets dismissed me as a pottai and would not let me in. When I tried to get into the men's toilet section, I was shooed away from there as well. In Delhi, they let me use the women's toilet, but here things were clearly different. Then there was the issue of entering the toilet dressed as a woman and coming out as a man. This was sure to cause trouble. I was confused and not sure what I could do. I had to somehow get into male clothes. The question was how. Finally, I told the man who stood in front of the men's toilets, collecting fare to enter them, that I was a man, and I dressed up as a woman for a show. Startled, the men who were peeing in there started yelling. I muttered, "I'm a man too," and ran into one of the bathrooms. I ought to have changed on the train, but the necessity of changing male clothes hadn't occurred to me then. Besides, I had traveled by a ladies' coach. Imagine what would have happened if I'd emerged as a man from the toilet. So that's one quotation. And then the other one, just a second. Yes, this is the second quotation from Tanuja's autobiography, which is called An Autobiography, Tanuja, and Tirunangai's Journey and Struggle. I kept asking my counselor to ensure that I am prescribed hormone pills. If I was prescribed hormones, I would have to wear female clothing for at least a year. But I was reluctant to go to school in female clothes because my body had grown muscular and my face now sported a beard and a mustache. I was scared that a man like me would be beaten up or even killed for dressing up like a woman. I would dress up like a woman only when I had to visit my counselor. I lied to him that I was always in female clothes. The above quotations illustrate the complex ways in which Tirunangais negotiate social, sexual, and legal norms that constitute and regulate gender. In the first quotation, Revathi is on her way back from Delhi to see her mother in Namakkal. She is dressed up as a woman and manages to pass off as a woman in the ladies' compartment. She cannot go home dressed up like a woman, and changing into men's clothes in a public toilet runs the risk of discovery. The man at the counter tries to shoo her away, thinking that she is a potte, which could, in certain contexts, mean a cross-dressing effeminate man. In certain contexts, when it's used among Tirunangais, it could actually refer to a Tirunangai or a trans woman. Revathi has no choice but to tell the man that she's a man who had cross-dressed as a woman for a performance. She realizes she could not have changed into men's clothes in the train for fear of being discovered by her female co-travelers. Revathi has to carefully traverse gender lines without being discovered, for which she has to compromise her own sense of self and deceive others with her performance. Note that the transgendered subject is constituted by a dialectic between cross-dressing and a normative social construction of the gendered body. Revathi does not always manage to pass off as a woman. When she has to use a toilet, she cannot use a woman's toilet. Her choice is already determined by the man's evaluation of her physical appearance and her performance as a cross-dressing man, which is a socially sanctioned but temporary inversion of gender. In the second quotation, Tanuja has to convince her counselor, the state and the German courts of law, of the seriousness of her decision to transition. But she cannot convince her counselor without putting her own life and dignity at risk. She decides to deceive him by dressing up as a woman only when she visits him. This presentation or this essay is a comparative study of two autobiographies. The first one, of course, is called The Truth About Me, a Hijra Life, published first in English, interestingly, in 2010. And the second is an autobiography, Tanuja, an Tirunangai's Journey and Struggle, that was published in Tamil, which has not been translated, in 2020. In an interview, Revathi also tells us why she decided to get her autobiography published first as an English in English translation. And she says that basically she didn't want. Initially, she was a little wary that her family and people she knew would attack her. She didn't want the autobiography to be read by people that she knew, people who probably did not read English. And she also, of course, wanted the autobiography to reach a larger readership. The 2010s have been a very crucial decade in the history of queer discourse in India, with the emergence of a whole spectrum of queer voices that have demanded justice in the face of gendered forms of oppression and homophobia. In the 2014 National Legal Services Authority versus the Union of India judgment, the Supreme Court of India passed a landmark judgment that upheld the right of all people to self-identify their gender. It was the first judgment to acknowledge the third gender or transgender people. The Supreme Court further decriminalized consensual sexual acts between adults, irrespective of their gender, in the 2018 Navtej Singh Johar versus Union of India judgment. The 2017 Supreme Court ruling on the right to privacy was a fundamental right and applicable to the protection of sexual orientation that gave a reprieve to the LGBTQ community. The legal recognition of transgender people has only been the first step in a long struggle to demand equal representation in educational institutions and public employment, access to courts of law and medical care. Although the autobiographies I discussed were published 10 years apart, they resonate with each other and have shared concerns about the divergence between laws that protect the lives and rights of transgender persons and their fraught social realities where they have to constantly negotiate stigma, violence, exploitation, poverty, and structural exclusion. In the first text, The Truth About Me, a Hijra Life Story, in the preface to her autobiography, Revathi states that her autobiography is an account of, quote, her everyday experiences of discrimination, ridicule, and pain, and her endurance and joys. It's also an attempt to see her innermost life, quote unquote, innermost life as a hijra and sex worker. She also hopes that her autobiography, like her book of interviews of other hijras from Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, and Kerala, will enable a transformation in the way people perceive hijras by presenting hijras as agential subjects who are capable of more than begging and sex work. She clearly does not seek the government's sympathy, but demands the right to lead a dignified life in society. Um, Revathi belongs to a fairly privileged and middle-class Gounder family from a village in Namakkal, Salem, that owns land and has its own milk delivery business. Her father and older brothers were in charge of the business. Revathi was a boy named Doreswamy, who was the youngest son of 5 children that included 3 older brothers and a sister. Childhood is a formative stage in the lives of Tirunangais like Revathi, where they enjoy the freedom to explore what it means to be feminine for the first time. In Revathi's case, it's also a phase when gender and caste prejudices become apparent. The presence of caste uh, is evident from her description of her village, which was demarcated as Tamil villages are along caste lines. The lower caste groups had to work on fields that were owned by Gaunders and were not allowed to participate in the temple festivals. She remembers being reprimanded by her mother for sharing food with the son of one of the Dalit peasants who worked on her father's land. From the time she was a boy, she remembers playing games that girls normally play. She is made to realize that she's different from most boys of her age. Revathi remembers being humiliated and abused for dressing up and walking like a girl. She's bullied and shamed by her classmates for being effeminate, but she's ironically happy for being acknowledged as a girl. As she says early in the autobiography, quote, being a girl was natural to her. She did not know what it meant to be a man. The autobiography also draws attention to certain forms of feminine embodiment that are socially and ritually sanctioned in particular contexts. One of the crucial ways in which an everyday notion of femininity is enacted is domestic labor. As a boy, Revathi enjoys helping her mother in what is conventionally regarded as feminine forms of household labor, like cooking, washing dishes, and so on. Then there are at least two aesthetic spaces, one virtual and the other real, that represent the possibility of embodying femininity. One is that of cinema, and the other one is of religious and theatrical performances. The medium of cinema offers an impressive, albeit ideal and stereotypical model of femininity that mediates and constitutes Revathi's self-perception. One of the South Indian actresses who shapes Revathi's imagination is the Kannada, Malayalam, and Tamil actress Saroja Devi. Revathi remembers skipping school and stealing money from her parents to watch movies for which she would be beaten up. She would secretly imitate Saroja Devi's gestures and mannerisms. Unlike Saroja Devi's cinematic performances that can only be emulated in the private confines of her room, Revathi enjoys social visibility and acclaim when she acts in plays and dances in religious processions. One of Revathi's early memories is performing the role of the mythical Chandramati, Raja Harishchandra's wife, in a play whose chastity and willingness to sacrifice her own self brings her husband and son back to life. Revathi remembers passing off as a woman, and her convincing performance of a suffering and self-sacrificial wife wins the admiration of the audience. So through her performance, Revathi temporarily transgresses gender norms by embodying certain ritual forms of femininity. She also envies the made-up girls who dance during the Mariamman festival procession. She also sees some boys dressed up as kurattis, or female gypsies, begging at the festival. She decides to dress up like them, for which she nearly gets beaten up by her brothers. But then she's spared when she tells them that she danced for the goddess. As a boy, Revathi is also conflicted by her homosexual desire for other boys and men. She's divided by her male body and her feminine self-expression. Note the unmistakable irony between social codes of masculinity and her discomfort with her own body and her inner femininity. When she's compelled to dress up like a boy or a man, she feels self-estranged and inauthentic. But when she dresses up as a woman, she's able to externalize her true inner self. This is the slide. In my Kurati garb, I could express all those female feelings that I usually have to suppress, and so felt happy for days afterwards. But I felt troubled by the feelings that men incited in me. I felt drawn to them, but I wondered if I should not be drawn to women instead, since I was a man. Why did I love men? Was I mad? Was I the only one who felt this way? Or were there others like me elsewhere in the world? I somehow got to class 10. I experienced changes in my body and being. I experienced a growing sense of irrepressible femaleness, which haunted me day in and day out. A woman trapped in a man's body was how I thought myself. Would the world accept me thus? I longed to be known as a woman, and I felt pain at being considered a man. I longed to be with men, but felt shamed by this feeling. I wondered why God had chosen to inflict this peculiar torture on me, and why he could not have created me wholly male or wholly female. I just forgot to mention that this translation is by the Gita. Revati's life changes accidentally when she encounters some cross-dressing men on a hill where the Namakal fort is located. She discovers that these men have undergone surgeries to become women, and they dress up like women only for their evening meetings. So they dress up as men otherwise, but they cross-dress for these meetings. Some of them live in Erode and Dindigul. And they become Revati's companions, and they address each other as women. And they also become a great source of hope and resilience and courage for Revati. Revati learns that she would have to go to Delhi or Mumbai to get her penis surgically removed. Her introduction to the world of Hijras fills her with hope and self-affirmation, and it spells the beginning of a very, very pathetic life driven by violence and a desire for a life of freedom and dignity. The autobiography traces Revati's journeys back and forth from Namakkal to Erode to Dindigul and then to Delhi, Mumbai, and back. So the entire autobiography is structured around Revati's constant travel between these different cities. So during her sister's wedding, Revati makes a secret trip to Dindigul wearing a sari and wig, where she meets some Hijras. One of the Hijras, who later becomes Revati's adoptive Hijra mother or guru in the Hijra kinship scheme, tells her that she resembles the actress Revati, the South Indian actress Revati, which is what inspires her name. Revati passes off as a woman because of her hairless and womanly appearance. Her guru cautions her to never reveal her penis when she urinates in the open, lest she's discovered. When her guru decides to go to Delhi, Revati, who is more attached to her than she ever was to her own mother, wants to accompany her. But her guru tells her to study further and get a job to spare her of the miseries of a Hijra life. Later on, Revati encounters a group of Hijra performers from Erode and accompanies them to visit her Erode Nani, as in her grandmother, again in Hijra kinship terms, which would be her guru's guru. So her guru's mother or her guru's guru runs a dance troupe that performs at temple festivals in nearby villages. Although Revati is keen to become a part of the troupe, they tell her that she would only be accepted if she grows her hair long and looks feminine. Revati's inclusion into the Hijra community has to be a ritually sanctioned process that includes performing chores and errands for the elders of the community that would make her eligible for nirvana, which is a ritually sanctioned form of emasculation where the Hijra's penis and testicles are severed by the Tayamma, a Hijra who has been appointed for the ritual, and her acceptance into the community. So, of course, when she comes back to her family, Revati is again beaten up, and she's compelled to work for her family's milk delivery business. But she's determined to transition and to go back to her Hijra family. She realizes she doesn't have money to go to Delhi, and she steals one of her mother's earrings and pawns it with the help of one of her cross-dressing friends, and manages to buy a ticket in an unreserved compartment. She takes a train for the first time to Delhi, and she ends up meeting her guru, who lives in a Tamil colony in Wazirpur with other Hijras like her. Her guru is anxious of being accused of converting men into women when she sees her coming dressed up in a shirt and a lungi. So Revati is still dressed up as a man in a shirt and a lungi, and her guru is worried that she might be accused of converting men or forcing them to transition. Her guru and her chelas earn their living by doing badhai work, which is where they're invited to dance at weddings and bless newborn children. Revati's experience of the Hijra family is an ambiguous one. On the one hand, Hijra kinship offers Hijras like Revati a sense of community and belonging. It is a hierarchical kinship system that is constituted by women who have to perform certain tasks if they want to become a part of the family. Every Hijra is allotted certain ritual and social obligations that would sustain the kinship structure. In a guru's house, for instance, the Hindi-speaking chelas of the house or gharana perform badhai, while the others have to beg and give a portion of their earnings to their gurus. But on the other hand, the family also makes absolute claims on the loyalty and personal life of every Hijra, who is obliged to sever ties with her own family and renounce romantic desire. Revati is divided by her loyalty towards her Hijra house and her fraught love for her own family. She writes a letter to her family without her guru's knowledge, telling them that she has come to Delhi in search of work. Later on, of course, she's discovered by a lorry driver from Namakkal who accidentally discovers her and then reports her to the family. And her family accuses, takes two Tirunangais to the police station and accuses them of selling Revati to beggars in Delhi. Her mother fakes an illness and sends Revati a telegram asking her to visit her. And when she heads back, that's the description of the first quotation I read out when she's heading back to her place from Delhi. And that, of course, that passage, which the very first quotation, of course, highlights the train and the public toilet as these very socially promiscuous spaces where Revati runs the risk of being discovered and humiliated. But what's also interesting is that Revati is more fortunate than other Hijras because she's able to pass off as a woman, but having a penis remains a constant source of shame, revulsion, and anxiety. Once she reaches home, of course, she discovers to her dismay that her mother's fine and that she's been beaten and she's beaten and tortured by her brothers. Her mother takes her to the Samayapuram temple, where an Amman temple or a Devi temple, where her head is shaved and her hair is offered to the goddess. Losing her hair causes Revati more pain than the pain her brothers inflicted on her. She feels as though she has lost her femininity. It's like this very defeminizing process. Without her hair, she can neither accept herself nor will she be accepted by the Hijra community, for whom long hair is an essential marker of femininity and feminine beauty. She is sent by her guru to her nani later on, who has now moved to Mumbai. Unlike her guru, her nani lives a relatively comfortable life with her chelas who sing and dance for a living. Revati notices that Hijras do not observe caste, class, and religious differences. If there's any conflict between Hijras, it exists among Hijras who belong to different gharanas or houses over claims to beg and sex work. So Revati is told that she can have two gurus, one in Delhi and the other in Mumbai, who's her nani's chela's chela, right? So the entire Hijra kinship structure is comprised of trans women who share certain fictive kinship terms of mother, sister, guru's guru, so on and so forth, right? So she becomes a chela in a consecration ceremony before the Nayaks. The Nayaks are the leaders of the 7 Hijra Gharanas. And of course, the entire Hijra system is a very North Indian system. Revati later on opts for sex reassignment surgery in a hospital, rather than nirvanam, which is seen as a far more risky and painful process, which can be fatal for some or for many Hijras. And after the operation, when she sees herself in the mirror, she feels like a complete woman, right? But of course, to be acknowledged as a true and complete woman in Hijra society only begins, with Nirvanam or SRS, and it becomes necessary for a new Hijra to get rid of facial and body hair, to grow her hair long, and to also embody certain feminine forms of modesty and bodily comportment. So later on, what I'd like to draw your attention to here is the very ambiguous kind of relationship that Revathi and also later on Tanuja has with the larger Hijra family. So while the Hijra family offers Hijras a certain degree of protection and support, it's also characterized by exploitative relationships between gurus and chelas who are obliged to give most of their earnings to their gurus, right, in exchange for protection and some form of social recognition. And the other interesting thing also is, the other important thing is the fact that there's no room for romantic intimacy as long as you're part of a gharana or a house, right? And this is something which drives Revati's loneliness. So she temporarily leaves her nani to join the Chauhan house in Mumbai, where Hijras, unlike the Hijras in her nani and guru's house, engage in sex work. And her decision to actually become an informal part of the Chauhan house has to do with her desire for intimacy. And of course, she confuses these two things of, sex work and romantic or emotional intimacy. And this is something that she actually realizes when she begins to do sex work, because she thinks that she might find some kind of romantic intimacy here, but she does not, because when she becomes a sex worker, she realizes how fraught the life of a sex worker is, because the Hijras of the Chauhan house lead extremely precarious lives that are always being threatened by the police or by violent clients who refuse to wear a condom or pay. So many of the Hijras are raped and exploited and run the risk of contracting STDs. Revathi herself is sodomized by one of her clients, but she's powerless to stop him or file a complaint, because as a sex worker, you don't really have a legal identity. I mean, you're not supposed to solicit customers in the first place. So she loses interest in sex when sex becomes work and her romantic desires are disillusioned. Another very important aspect of the autobiography has to do with Hijra's right to inherit property. And of course, this also became a part of one of the points of debate in the transgender bill, and the successive bills after 2014, which were a lot more regressive because they diluted many of the democratic, many of the rights that were enshrined or were mentioned in the original 2014 Act. So. For example, when Revati's brothers decide to retire from the milk delivery business, they demand a share of their father's ancestral property. Revathi decides to leave Kamatipura, which is the red light district in Bombay, and she returns to Namakkal, where she's initially unable to find a job. Her brothers threaten to kill her if she claims her share of the property, but Revathi is determined. Her family lawyer tells her that she cannot come to court dressed up as a woman, and so she asks her to send her father a letter demanding her share under her former male name, right, which is Doresami. Later, she's asked to pay the lawyer a large sum of money for the fees, as she does not have any money. So she accepts whatever her family has to offer. The ancestral land is divided equally among the brothers, and the money they get from selling the lorries is also divided among the brothers. Since the inheritance of ancestral property is a patriarchal transaction between father and sons, Revathi and her sister do not get a share of the land. Revathi is finally given a lump sum that she deposits in a bank account, and then she which is again, the bank account is under her male name, and she lives off the interest. Later, when Revathi asks her father to register the house in her name, her father fears that she will force her parents to vacate the house. When she tells them that the money she sent him to renovate the house was money she had earned from sex work, her father insists on returning the money. But Revathi is adamant, and then she threatens to set herself on fire if the house is not registered in her name. And of course, finally, the father relents and tells her that she will get the house only after his death. Revathi's life is this constant negotiation between belonging and not belonging. Belonging to a Hijra Gharana offers a certain degree of protection and support, even as it curtails individual freedom, while not belonging threatens her survival and for a lack of an education and employment. So later on, she moves to Bangalore, where she works in a hammam run by Hijras. She gets handsome tips from her clients, and she hopes she can continue to work at the hammam, where she earns money without being violated and exploited. But then she realizes that she will never have her own money and be accepted by her fellow Hijras until she becomes someone's chela. So she has no choice but to become the chela of a guru from the Hyderabad house. So this is the third time that she actually she finds the new guru again, and she becomes a chela again. And her Hyderabad guru again encourages her to, do sex work. Right? So it's this constant kind of vicious cycle. And again, when she again does sex work for the second time, she is exploited by her customers. She is exploited by a plainclothes policeman who mistakes her for a woman and steals her money and jewelry. She's perceived as a potential criminal who's devoid of rights and freedom. She is arrested by a policeman who takes her to a station where she's stripped and abused. She's forced to pay him a fine in court for soliciting customers. Right? Later on, she's humiliated and nearly stabbed by a man. The police who capture her at another moment promise to release her if she hands over 10 of her most regular clients or customers to them. And so many men are arrested, and then she fears that these men are going to avenge the humiliation. When she applies for a driving license, the police inspector asks her for her documents, but the police inspector who asks her for her documents refuses to give her a license because her ration card is in her male name. So she's asked to bring a certificate from the municipal office in her village that states that she has become a woman. The school instructor has to bribe the inspector when Revathi threatens to expose him on television, and she ends up with a license that says Doraisamy, who's now Revathi. Right? So she never quite, she's always at the interstices, right, of male and female, of being acknowledged and not being acknowledged. And what's also interesting is that Revathi is herself quite an unusual guru. She kind of learns a lot from her own experiences of exploitation and loneliness. So when she becomes a guru and she has chelas of her own, she pays for the initiation rituals, and she also lets them pursue their own romantic lives. Her chelas are English educated and they're fashionable, and they open up a new world for Revathi. She discovers Sangama, a non-governmental organization that initially at least works with homosexuals. She hears the word gay for the first time, and she also feels very awkward about not knowing English. It's also Revathi's introduction to this English-speaking world of politics, reified identities, politics, governmental identities, which have to be, identified with in order to get grants and money from NGOs, international organizations, and so on. Right. So it's a new world for her, a world where she's introduced to English. She has to learn English to a certain extent. She also discovers a world of pervasive violence and injustice that cuts across various sections of society. Dalits, women, homosexuals, transgender people, Muslims, and so on. So it kind of also fills her with a new sense of purpose. And so she's also kind of determined to fight for the rights of Hijras. She's no longer ashamed of her past and her stigmatized status. She also wants to fight against sexual violence and the victimization of Hijras. But this also requires Hijras or Hijra community to be visible. And many of the Hijras are initially wary of seeking Sangama's help. But it is only when Sangama actually succeeds in freeing Hijras from false police cases that they actually begin to seek their support. Revathi goes on to organize workshops where she addresses the rights of Hijras and police atrocities. She delivers talks in colleges and universities. She interviews other Hijras in her second book, where she identifies with their experiences of violence and humiliation that brings her closer to her community. And she also, of course, works for an AIDS prevention group in Karnataka. The very writing of this autobiography, of course, is a healing process for Revathi, a process that helps her to come to terms with her own stigma and humiliation. Her activism is a very empowering experience that helps her negotiate loss and romantic disappointment. Her quote-unquote marriage to a fellow activist from Sangama comes to an end when he doesn't have the courage to tell his parents that he is, quote, married to a Hijra and loses interest in her. Her chelas commit suicide. Her mother dies of disease, and her guru is stabbed to death by a man who wants her money. In the second text, coming to Tanuja's autobiography, there are lots of parallels, of course, but there are also certain very stark and very interesting differences, ways in which both the texts, both the writers, both the trans activists diverge in certain very important ways. Tanuja is a Sri Lankan Tamil Tirunangai whose family fled to Madurai during the Sri Lankan Civil War and later immigrated to Germany. She begins her life as a refugee whose precarious existence traverses both gender and political boundaries. As she says in her preface to her autobiography, when refugees migrate from a war-torn land, they don't just traverse land and water, they traverse death. Tanuja spends her early life in Kochadai, a Sri Lankan Tamil refugee colony in Madurai, and she belongs to a younger generation that has access to television and the internet. Like Revathi, Tanuja's early impressions of feminine beauty are drawn from the actresses and compeers she watches on television. When she's admitted to an English school in Madurai, she's impressed by one of her teachers and internalizes her majestic authority, which later on fuels her fantasies of ideal femininity. Like Revathi, again, she helps her mother perform certain domestic chores and so on and so forth. She also performs at the famous Kochadai Muttaya Temple festival in Madurai. She mistakes the Garagatam performers there for cross-dressing men, but later on she realizes that they are Tirunangais like her. And of course, that initially she doesn't have. I mean, initially she's not. She doesn't decide to join the community, but she's inspired by these Tirunangais who perform at the festival. And she also watches Tirunangas on television, and she watches this show where Tirunangais are getting married to Aravan at the Kuthanduvar festival in Kuvagam. So this is again a very interesting and important annual event for trans women, especially trans women, but also trans men to a certain extent, because this is an occasion when it's a story from the Mahabharata where Aravan, who is the son of Arjuna and the Naga princess Ulupi, is being worshipped and by the Tirunangais. And according to the epic, what happens in the Mahabharata, in the Sanskrit Mahabharata, is that Arjuna was married to the Princess Ulupi during his 1-year exile in the northeast, and Aravan grew up as a Naga warrior, and he participated in the Battle of Kurukshetra on behalf of the Pandavas. On Krishna's request, he offers himself as a sacrifice to appease goddess Kali, which was necessary to ensure victory for the Pandavas. Krishna, who's of course the main strategist for the Pandavas, offered Aravan 3 boons for his selfless act. The first boon was that his death in the battlefield would be heroic. The second boon was that he would be able to see the entire battle of Kurukshetra even after his death. The third and final boon was that he would be married before he dies. And of course, since no woman was actually willing to marry Aravan, because nobody wanted to suffer imminent widowhood, no one volunteered. So to fulfill Aravan's third wish, Krishna transforms himself into the enchantress Mohini and marries him. And the marriage was consummated, and then the next day Aravan offered himself in sacrifice to Kali. Mohini is heartbroken and she mourns her widowhood before she's transformed back to Krishna. So of the 3 boons granted by Krishna, the first and the third boons are ritualized in the Kuthanduvar festival at the Kuvagam, the Kuthanduvar cult at the Kuvagam festival, while the Draupadi cult includes only the second boon in the rituals. So which is why another term for trans women in Tamil Nadu is also Aravani, because they see themselves as married to Aravan and then being widowed. So they kind of it's a celebration of Aravan's heroic death on the battlefield, and his bust is placed on a long tall wooden pole, and it is decorated and painted for the festival, and it is taken around in a procession. And when he is burnt, when he dies and he's killed, so initially, of course, on behalf of Aravan, the pujari ties a Mangal Sutra or a wedding chain necklace around the necks of these Adavanis or Tirunangais, and then they are asked to remove their talis or Mangal Sutras when he dies, and then they all wear white. So to get back to the autobiography, so Tanuja's family moves to a German town that borders Netherlands and Belgium, where her father works in a hospital. Again, like Revathi, Tanuja has a very fraught relationship with her family when she's young. Her father is a very frustrated drunk who struggles to make ends meet. and he often beats Tanuja and her brother up. And her sister, again, is the only source of emotional sustenance. And when she's very young, of course, when Tanuja's family actually appreciates her feminine beauty, when she dresses up in her sister's clothes and adorns herself with her mother's jewelry. But later on, as she grows older, her family actually begins to disapprove of her femininity. In school, Tanuja is introduced to gender and sexuality and reproduction, to ideas of sexual consent, and to different notions of good and bad touch, but there's no discussion of transgender issues. She's left with the impression that gay men, for example, do not have the courage to resist their families in transition. So basically, she thinks that gay men are people who potentially want to transition, but they don't have the courage to come out and resist social opposition. When she learns in the center where she learns Dutch, she's teased for being effeminate and gay. Again, like Revathi, initially Tanuja also equates masculinity with heterosexuality, and she begins to wonder if she's a gay man, and then grows anxious that she'll never be able to marry and have children. The other interesting thing, of course, is that what actually differentiates Revathi's from Tanuja's world growing up is the fact that Tanuja comes of age in the 1970s and 80s when you still don't have access to internet, while Tanuja is a second generation German immigrant who grew up in the 1990s and 2000s, and of course also has access to multiple languages, German, Dutch, English, and so on. The internet introduces Tanuja to a new world of Tirunangais and the lived realities that reaffirms her own sense of self and opens up many possibilities of becoming a woman besides a whole host of other professional and romantic / sexual choices. So she has many sexual interactions with men under a pseudonym on webcams. Their admiration for her beauty is a virtual source of pleasure that fulfills her imaginary fantasies of being a woman. She's introduced to gay dating websites through many of her gay friends. She watches documentaries on gay people and Tamil-speaking Tirunangais living in Malaysia and Singapore. And what is also very striking is that despite the fact that Tanuja's autobiography is mostly set in Europe and Germany, it's a very Tamil world. Right? So she, all the people she knows, all the people she talks to, the people she meets, they're all invariably Tamil. So you can almost forget that it's a European setting. So she watches documentaries on. She watches a show where a Singapore Tamil Tirunangai named Bhuvana describes the wretched lives of Tirunangai sex workers and appeals to Tirunangais, asking them to abandon sex work. She also identifies with Bhuvana's description of her childhood and life. She discovers that hormone supplements are available for people who want to transition. She also learns that Thailand is a destination for many Tirunangais who want to undergo cheap and superior quality sex reassignment surgeries and breast implants. She discovers Rose, a very well-known Tamil Tirunangai from Chennai who hosts her own television show. And Rose also disabuses Tanuja of her impression that she wants to transition simply because she had disappointing sexual relationships. So Tanuja realizes that she's born with a woman's mind and sensibility, and that she's not gay. So there are many such instances, through the internet, that kind of opens up Tanuja's world. So she later on she spends unlike Revathi, who spends many years, many of her formative years, her youth, with gurus and fellow chelas, and she's constantly divided between a hostile family and the guru chela system. Tanuja also acquires a new family of Tirunangais, but her relationship with the larger Tirunangai community is a lot more flexible, because in Europe you don't have that very consolidated formal structure of the Hijra family that is constituted by a hierarchical relationship of authority and subservience. So the Hijra household may offer a certain degree of protection, but only at the cost of extracting a certain share of the chela's earnings and curtailing her personal independence. So Tanuja does experience a certain degree of exploitation, but the nature of the relationship with the larger Hijra community is a little different, right? Because Tanuja, for instance, does end up completing her education. She does manage to find a permanent job towards the end of the autobiography, and that also gives her the money and the mobility to actually, undergo a surgery without the necessary support of the larger community, and she doesn't have to live with them, which makes a big difference. So there are certain significant differences in their lifestyles of these two trans women. So Tanuja does a series of part-time jobs to support her family when her father runs into financial hardship and decides to pay for her own education. She actually, manages to sustain her education through a series of, mishaps, with, her father's violence, with, meeting men online who end up being exploitative and violent, and also with the experience of being an immigrant who is struggling to become a citizen. Right? So you have all these different social as well as economic and political concerns that characterize Tanuja's life, precarious life. So she works in a fast food joint, she washes dishes in a restaurant and so on. She applies for a position as a flight attendant in a German airline that is only open to cis women, women who identify as with their gender at birth, assigned at birth. And although she is shortlisted, she's finally rejected when they discover that she's not a cis woman. Then later on, she's offered a contractual job in a cosmetics factory where she has to conceal her identity as a trans woman. But she also, like Revathi, she also manages to pass off as a cis woman. Right? But then she's also being humiliated on racial accounts because she's dark and she looks different. And initially, she's also unwilling to do sex work because she thinks that it's a lowly profession. Although she does end up becoming, an escort, rather elite escort. Another interesting facet to Tanuja's life is when she discovers that German laws and hospital procedures have very strict and transphobic regulations when it comes to SRS. German law requires any man who wants to transition to consult a counselor or a psychologist for at least 2 years and wear female clothing for a year. So if the counselor or the psychologist is convinced, then he or she sends the client to a doctor who then prescribes hormone supplements. Only then does she get the permission to undergo an SRS. The state health insurance company covers these expenses and the SRS. So when Tanuja is referred to a counselor, she begins to grow her hair long, but later she discovers that her counselor is a sympathetic listener but has no experience with transgender people. So for Tanuja, as in the quotation, it's a challenge to be dressed as a woman at an age when she's beginning to look more and more like a man, because she's also entering puberty at this time. She's anxious that she might also get killed for cross-dressing. Right? So how does she, survive, live a life of safety and dignity, and yet convince her psychologist of the seriousness of her intention to transition? She is later on. She discovers that many of these counselors are only greedy for their share of her insurance money. Finally, she meets another counselor through a transgender friend who has had transgender clients, and he's convinced of her decision to transition. And when she's prescribed hormones, she is amazed by the visible transformation in her body. Right, so she has growing breasts, diminishing desire, disappearing body, facial hair, and so on. And finally, she gets a letter from the health insurance company giving her permission to undergo SRS. So she's actually quite fortunate, unlike many of her fellow Tirunangais who come from Singapore and Malaysia, who have immigrated to Europe and lived very poor and exploited lives as sex workers. Tanuja is actually is employed, and she's educated, and she's able to afford the surgery. Later on, another very interesting moment is when the doctor warns her that she may not be able to experience sexual pleasure once she transitions. And Tanuja has a very interesting and very mature and honest response. She says that after the surgery, what I feel is something that a woman can never feel. No woman or Tirunangai can feel the desire that I have felt so far. Sensations differ from person to person. Okay, so the SRS is successful, but the post-operative recovery is a very slow and painful process. The doctor gives her a lubricant and a rubber dildo that would have to be used regularly to actually ensure that her vagina acquires a certain shape. Right? And this ends up being a very excruciating process. And she even says that this is femininity. Right? This pain is bliss. This is what I longed for. I'm now a complete woman. So, the transition, of course, is not just, a transition to a new physical body, but it's also something which symbolizes her notion of what it means to be an ideal woman. Right? So, when she and what's also interesting is when Tanuja discovers her own body following her surgery, when she falls in love with a man named Jeevan, who is the first man to actually help her discover her pleasure that a woman experiences when her clitoris is stimulated. Right, so it's very interesting. I mean, even I'm not. I mean, regardless of whether we can identify or understand her experience, that she actually, she, through this man, there's this final coincidence between, an imaginary body or an imagined body and the real body, right? And where she, she believes and probably she does experience, um, a specifically feminine experience of sexual pleasure. Okay, and then later on, she gets a she gets a permanent job, and after a series of contractual jobs, she gets a permanent job, and then she actually does end up becoming a German citizen with a lot of struggle, because initially her application is rejected. Right? I mean, her application is rejected even after she submits her medical certificate following her transition. She submits a medical certificate along with her application to change her gender and name to the immigration office, but the application is rejected because she's still a Sri Lankan citizen at this point. And Sri Lanka has laws that acknowledge and protect the identity and rights of Tirunangais. Right? So it's very ironic that she's rejected on the grounds that she has protection, or she does get a certain degree of protection and recognition in Sri Lanka. So she discovers to her surprise that it is easier for those trans women who come from countries with hostile laws to get legal recognition of their adoptive gender. So she actually approaches the Sri Lankan consulate in Frankfurt to get her documents translated into English, but the consulate is unsure of the rules, that as they've never received a request like this. And they actually ask her to go to Sri Lanka to get her name and gender changed. But meanwhile, she manages to get a permanent job and she becomes a German citizen. Another point of coincidence between Revathi and Tanuja's autobiography is also the fact that Tanuja also has a very conflicted relationship with men, right? So, she has, very humiliating and violent encounters with men, which ironically also validate her sense of femininity. She's also sexually abused by an uncle when she and her sister moved to Colombo early in the autobiography to apply for a passport to go to Germany. And later on, she begins to actually eroticize the violence. And in the end of the autobiography, she actually ends up having sex with the same uncle, which for her is a vindication of her femininity and her affirmation of her uncle's hypocrisy. So it's very ambiguous. I mean, morally ambiguous, but the fact that these trans women actually have to negotiate their relationships with men, which invariably end up disillusioning the romantic fantasies, but also on the other hand, strengthening their resolve to actually, assert their feminine selves. Right? So it doesn't stop them from, wanting to transition or wanting to be identified as a woman. So it's and as I mentioned earlier, she has many encounters with Tamil men through Facebook, through different Tamil chat groups, but all the encounters actually end up becoming reaffirming the fact that these men are basically after money or after sex. Right? So, and she does end up having a very bitter experience with men. And what actually redeems her life ultimately is her intimacy with the larger Tirunangai community, and especially the Tamil community. She doesn't really have, or she doesn't mention her relationships with German or non-Tamil trans women, but she does. I mean, the very fact that she decides to write her autobiography in Tamil and not in German or Dutch itself speaks to the fact that she in fact she even says in a preface that she is she has a deep sense of kinship to the Tamil land, although she was just 3 months old when she was taken to Tamil Nadu, and then she was 6 years old when she went to Germany. So yeah, so there are these kind of, I won't belabor the point anymore. I would just end by saying that, many of these relationships only give her brief glimpses of what it means to be a woman. In some cases, what it means to be a man, or what it means to be a woman or a wife. I mean, I think Tanuja is also very self-reflexive. I mean, there's a point where she says that progressive women might humiliate me or might make fun of me, ridicule me for wanting to be someone's wife, right? Because both Revathi and Tanuja, perform the rituals of being, a Hindu wife, right? But Tanuja is also self-reflexive in the sense that she's very aware of the fact that other women might think that she is very conformist. I mean, she's buying into the institution of marriage when she should be uh, dismissing it, right? She says that that a husband or a partner is essential, right? Because she's unable to let go of her partners, despite the fact that they betrayed her, because she believes only a man or a husband can give her the validation that she seeks, right? So, I mean, a lot of this, the self-identification of themselves as women, is couched in this heterosexual and maybe also to a certain extent heterosexist dyad within the confines of marriage. Right? So, I mean, that's something that I'd like to just flag. So maybe I will just end here by just saying that both these autobiographies are testaments of Revathi and Tanuja's negotiations with sexual and social norms that regulate bodies and spaces. Their experiences of stigma, discrimination, humiliation, violence, and social and political disenfranchisement constitute their female subjectivities and agency. Even their romantic disappointments only strengthen their desires to assert their femininity, even if this means being estranged from their families and fellow Tirunangais. They grapple with their own desire for validation, but by the end, it is their solidarity with the Tirunangai community, albeit fraught, notwithstanding their internal differences, that empowers them and gives them a sense of purpose. So I'll end with that. Thanks, and thank you for listening. Hello? Hello?
Yeah. Kiran,
Yeah, I'm
can you hear
done.
me? Yeah.
Yes.
I think there's some audio glitch at our end.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I hope you could hear me throughout.
Yeah. I can
Hello.
hear you.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah. Hi.
Yes. I'm done.
Yeah. So if you can also type in the chat box, or you can put up a hand and ask. Vipul, I think Vipul wants to say something.
Just to say that, Kiran, I enjoyed listening to it.
Thanks.
And I don't have a question specifically on the content, but could you tell us any challenges that you experienced while drafting this paper?
Sure.
Methodological challenges, and how did you work how did you turn them around?
Thanks. Should we collect questions, or shall I answer this?
I think you should just go ahead and answer this, Kiran, by the time there are other questions.
Sure.
This is Rohini here.
Yes, thanks, Rohini. Yeah, so to answer your question, Vipul, I did interview Revathi. I didn't manage to interview Tanuja, although I'm in the process of translating her autobiography. But I did interview Revathi, and I had certain questions about, for example, how she identifies herself and what does she think about these terms, Tirunangai or Haravani and so on. And she said that she identifies herself as a woman, but the term Tirunangai is important when it comes to being an activist, when it comes to actually, asking for funds, donations. It's important as by way of politics and a certain politics of representation. And so it's both, right? So she kind of slips in between the two. And I had to frame my questions in such a way that I was very conscious and respectful of how they choose to identify themselves and how contingent these identities are on certain social and political contexts. And I also asked her about what she thought about the transgender bill, and she did mention the fact that the successive bills that have been passed after the 2014 Act in some ways also diluted the original act, which was actually very emancipatory, very democratic, very radical, and so on. So it's important that I asked her these questions because she was actually very lucid and very willing to answer questions about transgender or trans women's access to social spaces, access to civic rights, resources, housing, property, and so on and so forth. So it was good to talk to her because it actually gave me a sense of how the everyday realities and everyday struggles of their lives and their very ambiguous, ambivalent relationships with the larger Hijra/Tirunangai community. And I did not interview Tanuja, but from a reading of the autobiography, of course, she's a much younger person. There's a kind of a generation gap between Revathi and Tanuja. And Tanuja has access to different kinds of spaces, both virtual as well as social and real spaces. And she doesn't move around as much. Because in the sense that Revathi is constantly being hounded or haunted by her own loneliness, her own desire for intimacy, her own desire to be free, not being able to belong, and yet having to belong, and so on. So there are these dilemmas that characterize Revathi's life. But in the case of Tanuja, of course, she also has her own struggles because her family isn't entirely supportive until the very end. But her family actually ends up being a lot more supportive towards the end, unlike Revathi's family, and she does have someone to go to because she doesn't have the social structure of the Hijra kinship, the house in Germany or in Europe. And she also ends up having a lot of anonymous encounters with men that actually ends up in violence and exploitation. Right? So it's and she's also very, very active online. So what's interesting is that Tanuja has a very, even today, unlike Revathi, Tanuja has a very, very active persona on Instagram, on Facebook. She's very, very, and she puts up these very interesting performances or videos where she is, she's literally on your face in the sense that she's very sarcastic and she's very, tongue-in-cheek about, again, addressing a largely Tamil community because her videos are mostly in Tamil, addressing Tamil patriarchy, gender norms, and the ways in which she constantly reminds you of the fact that she is a trans woman and yet she's a woman at the same time. And she's transitioned very well, so you really can't make out. And but she is very, very conscious of the fact that she's addressing a transphobic, queer-phobic, patriarchal community. Right? So it's very interesting that she has that persona online. Yes.
Thanks, Kiran.
Yeah. Other questions? I think there was something in the chat. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. I think Abhishek has a question. Yeah. Thanks, Abhishek, for your question.
Other questions? Yeah, we have a question from Dr. Abhishek Kashyap on the text chat. So he's asking, hi Kiran, thanks for the presentation. Could you tell us a bit more on how expectations vary across cultures, South Asian and European, the internal codes, as it were, on how the transgenders negotiate their own spaces? You mentioned something about how the European communities tend to be more hierarchical. Did you intend to mean that South Asian communities have a more flattened structure?
Yeah, so I think I may not have conveyed myself clearly. I just meant to say that the Hijra kinship, the Gharana system is very clearly hierarchical, and that is North Indian system which came with the Mughals and so on. But it's but in the European system, something that Tanuja actually observes is that she does have brief encounters with white European trans women, and she doesn't say much about the nature of the interaction, and maybe I should ask her about that when I talk to her. But what's interesting, what she suggests is that white trans women do not seem to have the kind of social cohesion or a kind of a certain, in this case, also very international alliance of sorts, unlike Tanuja's, of course, very conscious attempt to get in touch with Tamil-speaking Tirunangais in Singapore, Malaysia, Tamil Nadu, Sri Lanka, and so on, and also Canada and diasporic populations. So she has connections with them, and she also has a lot of conflict. She has a very conflicted relationship with her own guru. Quote unquote guru, which is without the formal structure, who's again, trying to extract her share of earnings from what she earns as an escort. Right? And so and Priya, her guru's name is Priya, and Priya also has her own share of, her own experiences of exploitation in Singapore when Malaysia when she is a poor sex worker and so on. So she says that the white trans women seem to also come out, as in are more conscious and more vocal about their trans identities later in life. The doctor who performs the surgery tells Tanuja that he's surprised that she is just 19. He expected an older woman, like he does, because many of his white clients, his Caucasian clients, are older women, right, 40s and 50s. So now maybe I should probably ask Tanuja if this is a generalization or why is it the case? But it does seem to me that that, of course, German transgender laws are transphobic, and it takes a lot of convincing, a lot of humiliation, a lot of negotiation to actually convince the state that you want to transition. But in some sense, Tanuja's also, can somewhat belong to the Hijra family, but without the formal structure. So it spares her of the lot of exploitation. It's a little bit more dispensable than it is for Revathi, right? Because Revathi is growing up at a different time and she doesn't have any support from anybody else. So she has nowhere else to go to. So that's what I meant. So I don't think the European context is more hierarchical. They might have been racial, of course, racial hierarchies, but I am, at least at the moment, not entirely clear if there is a hierarchy between white trans women and Indian or non-white trans women, as trans women, and not necessarily as immigrants. Yeah. I think John has a question.
Yeah. Hi, Kiran.
Hi.
Yeah. Thanks for that paper. It's really fascinating for me also, because
Thanks.
though I've not read any of these kinds of literature, it was quite an eye opener at many respects. Yeah. I think one thing that you kept stressing is the ambivalence of negotiating through different kind of spaces, different kind of situations. Is there a yearning for certainty in the midst of this ambivalence, or do you see a sense of? I'm sure there is, ultimately there is this kind of feeling of wanting to be settled or certain.
Right. Yes.
And however elusive that is,
Yes.
I think to be able to write about this also means that you reach a place where maybe you feel a certain sense of certainty.
Yes.
So I was just interested in trying to if you can throw more light on this kind of transition of where does it is it just staying ambivalent all the time, or is there a kind of movement to an understanding of certainty or whatever?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question, actually. So I think there are two possibilities, the way I see it. One is, the possibility of marriage. right? I mean, of course, right here in these two texts, there's no, I mean, they don't consider the possibility of romantic relationships between trans women or between trans men and trans women. Although when I spoke to Revathi, she did say that there were instances of, and of course, why should it not be possible, of romantic relationships between trans men and trans women. And she also runs a shelter for trans men. So what's interesting is that for her, certainty in this form is activism and opening up a shelter, having a sense of community, and to an extent also doing away with exploitation as far as possible, especially when it comes to, so that also means then being visible, being visible as an activist, fighting for rights, and also getting international donor money, which also has its own challenges, its own compromises, right? So it's not as if you just get money and then so so there are those other challenges. But if there is some, maybe even a contingent sense of certainty, it's about being an activist, having a larger sense of social purpose, and also disabusing yourself of all the the hierarchical norms that prevail in the larger Hijra kinship system. Right? So it's about learning from your own your own suffering, and in some sense reforming yourself, and then producing kind of reconfiguring yourself as a new individual who still cares for the larger trans community and wants to create a social kind of platform for people to voice their concerns and so on. And the other sense of certainty, if it is at all a sense of certainty, which is not arrived at in these two texts, is about being married and performing. So when, for example, when Revathi falls in love with this man, he's a bisexual man, right? So there is this anxiety about bisexuality, right? About whether, and this is of course a very prevailing biphobia that prevails among many queer communities, which is about whether they're interlopers. Right? Who are they faithful? Are they more faithful to men or women, and who will they sleep with? I mean, there's the assumption that they are more fickle, or they're so. The fact that is it possible to have a stable relationship with a bisexual man, and the man also tells her that he doesn't believe in marriage. So it's one thing to say that I don't believe in marriage, and I don't believe in the conventions of marriage, but it's something else to also then say that because I don't believe in marriage, I'm very likely to lose interest in you, right? And that's exactly what happens, right? So at some level, of course, Revathi expects a monogamous ideal, of conjugal happiness and joy, and she, for a brief while, she performs very religiously, performs the role of a married woman and a wife and so on. In fact, she even asks him to tie a tali, which he refuses, but then she ties a tali to herself, partly also because she doesn't want the neighbors to think that they're just living together. So it's interesting because she makes her sister's mother-in-law pass off as her own mother-in-law because that man's parents aren't willing to accept her. So she finds a flat under the pretext of this very complicated charade, and then she ends up performing this role of a wife, which then soon ends up in heartbreak because the man is no longer interested in her and keeps absorbed he's absorbed in work and so on and so forth. So it's a very, very thin line, one, to believe in marriage and monogamy, and then to believe in wifely role, self-reflexively performing the role of a wife, and then wanting that ideal. And later on, of course, when I spoke to Revathi, this is very clear. She says that as an activist, she actually realizes she realizes that there are many different ways of performing femininity. She also begins to question what then people began to see as a very heteronormative institution of marriage and monogamy. Right? So, yeah, that's what I meant to say.
Thanks.
Yeah. Yes, Rohini.
Yeah, Kiran, thanks very much for your paper. One realizes how much autobiography contributes to your understanding of the whole cultural and social life of something which is so, obviously, unknown to us, and it sort of opens up that world. So thanks very much for that very detailed, kind of summary or description of the autobiographies, both of them. My question was actually, with regards to what you said about the Hijra system prevailing in North India. So I was very, interested, in this, because one there are two aspects to it. One was it immediately put me in mind of Arundhati Roy's that tome of a book, The Mystery of Utmost Happiness, where you have that community, and it made me understand what she was trying to do through that. After your presentation of the autobiography, so thanks very much, Kiran, because I did not really appreciate the fact that there is a Hijra system, actually a system prevalent in North India, which perhaps is not there in South India. I do want to ask you, about South India, and what then is in the absence of a system, what is there, right? So I do want to ask you that. But before that, I just wanted to, sort of speak. I'm speaking aloud, as it were, because when you sort of connect this Hijra system in North India to the whole Mughal history, then one really wonders about the the history of the sexuality in the culture of North India, and how is it that transgenders, even when you look at historical films, that there's always a couple of transgender characters who are, presented as being part of the darbar of the Mughals. So, what is this different sexuality, and what kind of work has happened on that? So one has assumed this to be the norm without really understanding it. So, so I'm glad to have understood this. So thanks very much. The second part of this question was actually, would you know anything more about this this connection in North India? And the second, of course, in South India, then how is it that what was obviously a prevailing kind of understanding of sexuality or acceptance of sexuality, different kinds of sexualities, how is it that in South India that has not had any influence historically, I'm saying? Would you know anything about it?
Thanks, Rohini. So in response to your first question, it's Revathi says in an interview that they were called eunuchs. Right? I mean, in English, it's called eunuch, and there's a lot of debate, lots of layers of differences between Hijra and eunuch, and whether people want to equate Hijra with eunuch, because the assumption is that eunuchs could afford to be, you could actually entrust the harem to a eunuch, because she is seen to not have any kind of sexuality. Right? It's not about the gender; it's about who lack agency and are asexual, right? And of course, here in some sense, she's also being critical of the whole Tamil ideal, also of the chaste ideal virgin woman and so on and so forth. So so there is that angle to it, and in the south you have a lot of breakaway hijras. I mean, the kind of the hijras she meets actually in Tamil Nadu are hijras who had some kind of an alliance or connection with people in Bombay and Delhi. And at some point, they may have broken away, or they may have broken away for different reasons. Of course, one, because it was, it wasn't as protective a haven as they thought it was. I mean, it may have been exploitative. It may have been violent. It may have been, really all these things. But some of them also end up becoming, cross-dressing, performers in religious festivals. Some of them, I mean, and what's also interesting is the changing political climate of these different states. Tamil Nadu being seen as a more politically conscious, assertive state, which has given its transgender population a certain degree of, visibility, ration cards, rights, representation, subsidized SRS, and so on. That there's an attempt, or there's a temptation to kind of move away and probably live, in Tamil Nadu at least, where you have a certain degree of visibility and recognition. So there is that.
Actually, Kiran, my question was more sort of with regards to the history of it and history of this, the acceptance of this sexuality. So when you read Mughal history, and you also, Mughal history. I mean, I'm no historian, but I do have a basic reading of Mughal history. And when you read contemporary histories of the Mughal, the changes that Mughal history had to undergo post colonization, which many books have talking about, you do realize a lot of political power also resided with transgenders who were part of the court, right?
Absolutely.
So this is, this sort of, then when you connect it to the fact what you're saying now, the Hijra system, then it begins to make a lot of sense that there is a kind of a visibility and an acceptance of different kinds of sexualities, which perhaps was there, right? So this is for me.
Yeah, no, not quite actually. I mean, it's an acceptance of maybe a certain non-gendered identity, not necessarily interstitial gender or a transgender, a non-gendered asexual identity. It's important to be asexual even if you want to exercise political power of some sort, and to be, to have some kind of influence. You can't exercise your sexuality and be powerful at that time, And even if you did have a sexual self, it was of no political consequence, right? So I mean, the point is that it doesn't. Politics and sexuality do not intersect here. Political power and sexuality do not intersect.
But how about these these houses where sort of hijras make where these organizations or I mean, I'm not saying political organizations, but where they get together, I mean, where they live together, where they reside, where they, I'm sure would exercise some kind of say or at least some rights for themselves, in the historical context, wouldn't they? I mean, if they were to make an entry at the political level, it could, it only have been possible if there was a certain kind of, ready kind of space for them, whether it accepted or not.
Yes,
some space
absolutely.
would be there, wasn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that there's no official registering of a certain sexuality. That's what I'm saying. They might have been politically. See, what actually happened, we don't know. But at least in official history, there is no acknowledgement of them. Of them possessing a sexual being. Right? I mean, it's about being, the caretakers, the harem, and also influencing the queen or whoever it is, right? To make certain decisions. Vested interests, but nonetheless. Thank you. Oh yes, I just want to say that the second question, there is these Revathi talks about having very often having two gurus, one in the state where you come from in the south, and then having another one in Delhi or Bombay, right? And so there are two different kinds of relationships, right? One who is a local guru, or a guru who is who in some sense is constantly supervising your movements and is entitled to your earnings and so on. And there's another guru who is attached to the larger system, which becomes necessary because when you have to undergo certain initiation ceremonies, when you have to induct another chela into the system, if you want to become another guru's chela, so you're not entirely severed. You don't entirely sever ties with the larger system. It's always there somehow, unless of course you have an education, you have a job, and then you can just completely do your own thing. But in Revathi's case, it's difficult.
Thanks, Kiran.
Yeah, thanks. Any further questions? Sorry, I couldn't share my slides with you again. I got a little carried off, but yeah. So it's...
Right. I don't think there are any more questions.
Okay.
So,
all right.
Can you bring this to a close, Kiran?
Yes, sure. Okay.
Yeah. So, Yeah, thanks so much
Yeah,
for that.
thank you so much.
Speaking
Thanks all.
talk. Yeah, I'm sure we enjoyed it very much and raised several very thought-provoking issues, which we might, discuss at greater length later. So thank you everyone for joining us, and we'll see you in the next Faculty Conversations meeting very soon. Thank you.